same time, 1856 to 1914, who was a black leader associated with elites and kind of black commerce. Colescott says, so what he does is he represents, there's a play on words between the leaders of an African American tradition and a mainstream American tradition on the one hand, but this is executed by using racist stereotypes, as you can see in the whoops, sorry about that. In the painting, I think it's pretty obvious, yeah. And I'm showing you a 1907 postcard, which gives you one of those racist stereotypes. So again, what he's doing is showing the inclusion of African American life into the American myth as a form of racist exclusion simultaneously. But let me just read to you how Colescott himself describes what he was doing in this painting. And this is a quote from the artist himself. He says, "I was talking about the way US history was taught when I was growing up. There were two blacks mentioned as significant in US history, George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington, those two other Washingtons I mentioned. Just two." This is him again. "By contrast, the menial workers," and here are a number of names that probably are not well known outside of the United States that are kind of racist stereotypes for African American caricatures. These were, then he lists them, Stepin Fetchits, Aunt Jemimas, boot blacks, etc., were too well known to us and everyone. Their influence weighed heavily when we were only allowed two heroes in all US history, unquote. So what the basic issue here is that he is using racist stereotypes because they are in fact part of the American history of black experience, but he's placing them into this mainstream account, again, to show how inclusion also is constitutive with dispossession. And interestingly, though it's not an issue that I can get into in any detail in this talk, but I think it's very interesting how humor is used here to reverse qualities or properties as a liability into a kind of asset. That's something we could talk about if there's interest. And here's another blank slide. And I'm just going, here is where I want to read to you a passage from the book where I describe the work of Robert Nichols, who develops this idea of inclusion, dispossession through inclusion, which is particularly important to how I'm looking at these questions today. So please be patient with another short passage. Robert Nichols has proposed a precise definition of dispossession in his book, Theft is Property. He writes, quote, "Dispossession may be coherently reconstructed to refer to a process in which new proprietary relationships are generated under structural conditions that demand their simultaneous negation. In effect, the dispossessed come to have something they cannot use except by alienating it to another." So I know this is a kind of a dense passage to listen to, and especially if it's in your second language, which is, thank you for your patience listening to me in English. Basically what he's saying is that their property values are attributed to someone only to be taken away. And the two examples of this are that he goes into that I won't read out to you, but I'll describe. Are first how Native American indigenous land in the United States, which was not considered property by Native American people, was reorganized as property by the American government so that it could be sold away from the Native Americans. So in that sense, having property was just the first step toward being dispossessed of it. And the second example, which he quotes Saidiya Hartman and other important African-American literary and philosophical theorists as discussing how in slavery, the enslaved person had no civil rights except when they committed a crime. Whoops. The echo. That's okay. It maybe makes some kind of sense. So in other words, the only time that an enslaved person would be attributed with legal personhood was when they were being prosecuted or punished for a crime. This is what's meant by inclusion through dispossession. Okay, so if representation is thus equally a form of dispossession, not always in as extreme a way as the one I just described, then what are the ramifications of this for us who are interested in cultural things, and particularly the museum? Now, the museum, like democracy, is a site of inclusion through representation, right? Different cultures are represented, different ethnicities, different genders, different sexualities are represented in the contemporary and modern museum. Actually, the modern, since the beginning of museums, it's just that it wasn't so much genders or sexualities as it was different ethnicities and races. And yet, as Robert Nichols has just argued, as I've stated, drawing from histories of indigenous people and post-colonial theory, inclusion can operate as a form of dispossession. Some cultures are represented, for instance, as primitive, as we know from museums, or otherwise less advanced. The museum creates a hierarchy of value among cultures. We could look at, the British Museum layout and maybe even go through that exercise if we had more time. But also, the museum is literally the site of dispossessed objects that are appropriated from different places. And here I'm showing you the triumphal entry of monuments from Napoleon's looting, an etching from 1793 to 1803 by Pierre Gabriel Berthaud, which shows the process of how the Louvre was actually put together, which had to do with making collections both from appropriated forms of French Ancien Regime culture, both churches and aristocrats on the one hand, and looting from the rest of Europe that Napoleon did, often with curators, or what we would call curators now, as part of his entourage, his army, who would move right with him to collect works along with the military action. So here I want to read my last excerpt and quote a very interesting and less well-known theorist and archaeologist from 18th and early 19th century France, Casimir de Quincy, who is often considered a conservative, but who really very precisely described what it meant. That gives us a sense of how museums were deeply institutions of dispossession from the beginning. Okay, so A.C. Casimir de Quincy, the eminent French scholar and archaeologist, saw clearly that the museum collections built during the Revolution and Empire were meant, French Revolution and Napoleonic Empire, were meant, were mechanisms for art's alienation, its transformation into a deracinated form of currency. For him, the work of art derived its power from sentiment, an ineffable affective quality, which was closely tied to its intended purpose, which in French also, the term he used, destination, is also, the purpose is very much located in a place. In space and time, and especially to the community of spectators for which it was made. He contrasted sentiment to arid forms of intellectualized critique, which valorized the rules of form and historical comparison. The museum to him was a space where artworks were both drained of meaning and accumulated so wantonly as to render impossible a personal encounter between viewer and artwork. For Casimir, then, art's animating principle, sentiment, was lost in the disorder of the warehouse. As he wrote in 1815, quote, "Stop telling us that works of art are stored in these warehouses. Yes, you have transported them physically, but were you able to transport the full flock of tender, profound, melancholy, sublime, or touching sensations that surrounded them?" Unquote. It's quite a florid text, but not inaccurate. The body of art could be displaced, but not its soul, in other words. In a statement directly that's irrelevant. Catumer argues, finally, that the museum kills history. He writes, "Moving all the monuments so as to gather up their dispersed fragments methodically, classify their debris, and make of the grouping a lesson in modern chronology, is for a living nation to become a dead nation. It is for the living to attend their own funeral. It is to murder art to write its history. It is not to write the history of art, but its epitaph." In other words, for Catumer de Quincy, who is writing at exactly the moment of the constitution of the modern museum, it was already the death of objects, just the way, and this is my point in bringing up this history, just as more contemporary critiques of the looting of works of art from the global south have become one of the most political issues in art of our day. And in fact, it's interesting that, and here I'm showing you on the left an image of the military expedition in which Benin monuments were stolen in West Africa from the Benin people, and on the right is one of their many destinations in the West, the Pitt Rivers Museum. Some of you may be aware of the work of Dan Hicks, who has popularized, or that's a kind of negative way of putting it, who has worked really hard to make clear the problems with the looting of these objects. My point here, though, is that while this is a post-colonial problem, it also was an intra-European problem with the museum from its very moment. Just to underline the post-colonial issue here, though, it's worth reading the important theorist of negritude and poet Aimé Césaire, who launched nearly identical charges as Catumer de Quincy in his discourse on colonialism. But instead of attending to the intra-European plunder that Catumer claimed, Césaire decried the museum's symbolic murder of Europe's colonial subjects. In commenting on the museum, he declares, "Europe would have done better to tolerate the non-European civilization at its side, leaving them alive, dynamic, and prosperous, whole and not mutilated. That it would have been better to let them develop and fulfill themselves than to present for our admiration, duly labeled, their dead and scattered parts." So it's quite interesting that a 19th century conservative archaeologist in France and a 20th century radical poet and proponent of negritude basically say the same thing about the museum, and also bracket its moment of initial intra-European imperialism and mid-20th century colonialism. So how am I doing for time? Because we started what do you think, Daniel? Oh, okay, 15 minutes, then I'm fine. Okay. So what I want to do now is, I've laid out a kind of question around the museum as an institution that, like democracy, is characterized by inclusion through dispossession. And I've tried to do this both on a symbolic level by thinking about the inclusion of different cultures and ethnicities, later genders, etc., but also on a literal level, in the sense that objects are literally dispossessed from their source communities and montaged within the museum construct. So I want to pivot and finish by looking at two examples of recent innovations in collections, and I don't really have an answer about how effectively they address the problems I've laid out. They're more a kind of set of open questions, and maybe we'll have a chance to discuss this. So the first of them is in Rotterdam, and it's the Depot Boijmans van Beuningen, which is a building that was completed, let's see, what year? Just 2 years ago, that I recently visited and also write about in the preface to the short book, Art's Properties, that does something very interesting and unique. It takes the idea of open storage and makes it into a freestanding museum attraction. So basically, many of you may know the Rotterdam Museum, the Boijmans van Beuningen, which actually came up this morning, I think, as one of the European Council, right, if I'm saying that correctly, sites or institutions. A great, small, but quite broad within a Western sense, museum in Rotterdam that emerged from a private collection. But they decided, instead of having most of the collection out of view, that they would build this depot, this storehouse right next to the museum, which is currently under renovation, where they would keep the entire collection and invite visitors to visit. So it's a very interesting building in its kind of symbolic aesthetics. On the left, I'm showing you the facade, which is completely mirrored. It's a bowl-shaped building of about 6 or 7 floors with a kind of roof garden at the top. And you can see that it reflects the city, and its model of representation is completely mimetic, right? It is the mirror as a mode of representation. And I guess what one usually says is that it disappears by reflecting what's around it. But in the slide on the right, you see what it looks like on the inside. It's a kind of Piranesi-like labyrinth. It's basically, in my view, it's kind of like a materialization of the internet, in that it has this strange stairways, glass cases, and it's really as disorienting as this looks. But, so in a way what you have is a mirror wrapping a human algorithm, because you can go in and look at whatever you want, but actually it's not just a human algorithm, and you can't actually look at whatever you want because most of it's behind glass. But what you can do is scan QR codes on your phone and get information about stuff that you're looking at. So basically it is like surfing the internet. It's a kind of museum as search engine, wrapped in a mirror, which I think is symbolically interesting because it's the most, we could say, right, it's the most primal form of representation. But then one of the other interesting qualities of this museum is, or depot, it's not a museum, is that it really is a working storage depot. Even though people are coming in, you can see in the lobby here, in this, you walk into the lobby and you can see the crates and technicians if something is being moved out, which is literally happening. This isn't a performance. But what it does is it kind of spectacularizes the logistics of the museum. So instead of there being a kind of grand narrative, right, like what we saw in the British Museum, where you go from the ancient cultures to the Enlightenment to contemporary, with sort of non-Western cultures arrayed on the peripheries in some levels. I'm not saying that as my own value judgment, but a kind of museological norm. Here what you have is a spectacle of the museum itself as a logistical entity. You see things being created, you see things in their storage, and you see various forms of metadata, which is literally available on your phone. The metadata that you see on your phone is from the museum itself. And I just can't help, this is kind of vulgar materialism, but Rotterdam, as I'm sure you're all aware, is one of the major ports in Europe. And when I went to visit the museum, I did take a tour out of interest of the port, which is one of the biggest container ports on this continent. And there is a kind of way in which the work of art in this depot is being understood, as this kind of logistical miracle on some level, and also as a kind of sublime demonstration of accumulation. So, and again, I said a moment ago, and I really sincerely mean it, is this an advance? I mean, I think that the idea here is that the problem of dispossession through representation that the museum has of, most collections, most large collections are mostly in storage most of the time. And so how can you say that a public affordance like a museum is really public when really, it's like going to the library and you'd only see 7% of the books, right? And the rest are just there to make you feel like, wow, there are a lot in there. So does this help? Maybe. I think it probably does. Or does it create a different kind of exclusion of meaning on some level, in the sense that the work of art here is really being understood as one, kind of as a searchable form of entertainment and a spectacle of logistics, as I'm mentioning. Now that sounds pretty negative, but I still feel like I would keep an open mind about this. I think open storage is a very interesting dynamic in general. And then the second model that I want to just briefly mention, and won't really analyze in any deep way, is the experiment of Documenta 15, the last Documenta that was last summer, that some of you may have visited, which was organized by the Indonesian collective of artists Ruang Grupa, and was extremely controversial in many ways, which I'm not going to get into in this context, though we could certainly talk about it in the question and answers. But here, I feel like what the Boijmans Depot is doing is giving a sense of false transparency, right? Like, here is the collection. It's all available to you. You can have it all at your fingertips, literally, in your phone. What Documenta 15 did was bring together several different collectives from different parts of the world. And those of you who may have visited it may agree with me that it was a show that was very difficult to consume, both in the sense that so many different cultural localities were brought up that would require a great deal of thinking and research and reading in order to even access in a superficial way, but also there was a huge amount of material within those different presentations. But I think that this opacity, this refusal to translate or to make available, also had a kind of effective political statement, which was that archives like the one that I'm showing you just a picture of very superficially, and of course, the archives of women's struggles in Algeria, which was one of the collectives that was archives that was brought into play in Documenta. The message, it seems here, is that the archive requires an effort of translation and an effort to enter. Now, in some level, I think that Documenta 15 created, if the depot did a spectacle of logistics, this was kind of a spectacle of the archive, right? Which was very hard to actually use unless you decide to enter into an exhibition in a very different way. One could go and spend a lot of time in a very few things, which I think might be an interesting kind of solution. So just to kind of finish up then, I think that what I'd like to propose is that the kind of montage that with Hannah Hoek had to do with different images coming from different sources, the representation of an ancient sculpture and a contemporary fashion magazine, or the British Museum that had to do with the juxtaposition of different displays or collections, that if we think of what is a montage of archives, that both the Documenta proposed, but also I think the idea of open storage is a kind of montage of archives. So they're much harder to access on some levels, but they might in fact be more true to the kind of opacity and difficulty of knowledge. The dispossession here is the dispossession from a false transparency, a false accessibility, which is more about consumption than it is about actual knowledge. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much for listening.
How long do we have to Q&A? 15 minutes. So, well, thanks very much, David. It's very interesting. And we're going to open. Maybe I will start with, I'm not sure if it's a question, but maybe a feeling that the tone of this dialectic of inclusion in dispossession is quite pessimistic.
Yeah.
And when you show the mirror, the museum, the pole, the one museum, of course you see the mirror, but my first observation when I looked was a boat instead of a mirror. And the boat is something that brings you in different places and put together different places and different regions in different contexts. And this idea of linkage, of bringing together the differences. And the idea of democracy being also the inclusion through dispossession, I think is also a bit pessimistic idea of democracy, because it's also a place where you can produce or bring forth a voice or a subjectivation that was not there before. And through bringing that forth, you produce conflict. And the idea of democracy is this idea of disagreement, and put in these terms. And I think that when the dispossession is underlined in the inclusion, I wonder where is the place for the other concept that you worked earlier, which is synchronization. And can we synchronize different cultural rhythms, go through time, and is that possible? And how do we deal with this cultural ready-made that we are always appropriating different cultures? And of course, the curated cultures can be also curatorial cultures, not only be the object of curatorial mainstream gestures, but they themselves can reorganize the archive. For instance, now in Brazil there's a whole discussion of how the Afro-Brazilians or the native Brazilians, the indigenous people, are themselves the subject of their own representation, right, and how they are included in the museum to, in a way, reorganize the collection or rethink the collection. So it's just trying to move in another level, not to put so much focus in what we lose when we dispossess a culture.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, so two answers to the pessimism. One is, yeah, I mean, you know, it's a particularly pessimistic moment, I think, in the United States. And this, yeah. I know your country is part of this too. But I also don't see it. I mean, it is true that the case I laid out does probably sound really pessimistic, but on the other hand, I think that it gives us some ways in. Like if we don't just assume that the museum is a democratic institution, but instead we see it as a place of disagreement, as you say, because in fact, what Documenta did, I think, was to take the idea of disagreement to an absolute extreme where there's almost no platform for conversation between these different propositions within the show. And so I think what it allows us is a space for experimentation in terms of how to stage disagreement that's genuine within a museum. And also the whole idea of, the guy Jason Frank I mentioned who has this idea of constituent moments, the idea, of course, of the people being aesthetic is actually very optimistic in many ways, because it means that that we in fact have a role in representing what it is that is sovereign in whatever arenas we're part of. I mean, the problem is that, not everyone has the same power to do that, but I think it's probably wrong to abdicate one's power, and I think cultural institutions are very important sites of that, which are, as you've mentioned, trying to do precisely this in many ways. Finally, I would say that Camila was talking about this term synchronization. I think you mentioned it in your introduction too, that comes from my book Heritage and Debt, where I tried to argue that what the possibility within a global world is to think different temporalities synchronized with one another, which can be an oppressive thing or it can be a liberating kind of idea. But the idea is not to think of one temporality, but rather a kind of montage of temporalities, in fact. It is a sort of montage, a forcing together or a bringing together of different temporalities or histories, as opposed to the dissolution of everyone's experience into one coherent global time. And so I think that synchronization and disagreement are really very close together, right? I mean, one is the temporal manifestation of the other, really.
Yes, absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, you gave the answer to your question, which was good. I didn't have to think too much.
So, it's open. Okay.
Thank you, I need this. Thank you so much, David. That was a really, really wonderful talk. I learned a lot, and I want to continue thinking about this idea of pessimism, because for me, the lineage of thinkers that you're bringing in, like Aimé Césaire, are really interesting to think with these ideas of the museum. And I'm wondering if the student of Césaire, Edouard Glissant, maybe came up in your thinking, because he sort of argues for opacity. And when I saw this museum the open storage space, I immediately thought of this, perhaps like the benefits of opacity, not in a pessimistic way, but perhaps like starting the conversation from the idea that we have to acknowledge that there's difference that cannot sometimes be understood, or perhaps that we should just think more critically about this idea of transparency. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think so too. I mean, I think that, if you think of opacity as a kind of form of, on the one hand, of privacy, and on the other, an acknowledgement of the difficulty of translating one experience to another. I mean, I think there is a tendency in a certain kind of global art exchange to both value and assume accessibility in ways that are really kind of misleading. And so I think that, I wrote a review of Documenta where I don't remember if I used the word opacity, but basically I praised it for its opacity. But it also, just to draw in one more thread from my lecture, this idea of the burden of representation, of, one being expected differentially depending on one's identity to stand in for, to represent that identity, versus others of us, such as myself, who is white in the United States, who, is not presumed to be responsible for whiteness in my everyday life. That Glissant, of course, his theory is very relevant to this, that the burden of representation is a burden of forced transparency, of kind of compulsory transparency. You must present your experience to us because you are other. You owe it to us. It's your responsibility to translate. So much, a lot of conversations around these questions have to do with, even in the university in the US, I don't know if you've had conversations like this here, but, when people of color or minority colleagues are often very, now there is a language for saying, we're not responsible for doing all the work of diversification in the university. The unmarked people, the white people, need to take some responsibility for this as well. That goes back to where it's not so pessimistic in a way. Mm-hmm. In a way, it's about sharing responsibility for representation, for thinking of it not as distributed according to identity in quite the same way. Thank you.
Thank you for such an interesting conversation. I would just like to add, following this idea of opacity, and picking up where you talked about the constituent moments. These constituent moments of representation are also constituent moments of visibility, of regimes of visibility, and the foundation of the museum, even if universal, lays on this idea of making knowledge visible, understandable, educational, and so on. So what I would also like to think with you and to have you comment if you think it's relevant, is the fact that one should also consider in this conversation that opacity can assume a form of non-visibility at all. And this can imply that there's no possibility even to consider the museum. And picking up on another thing here, and I think another layer, if we think of dispossession as a potential semi-error, because it assumes that there was a possession in cultures that do not assume objects or livings or experiences as their own, so as a possession, we may have to go to an extreme where it's not possible at all to pick up on something, even ambitioning on a more inclusive goal. Yeah. So opacity would stand here for not existing within those standards that we created since that time.
Yeah, I think what the upshot of this little new book is a controversy that in some ways was very local, but this gets your point, in the US about a painter named Dana Schutz who used an image of a young African-American boy who had been lynched, and there was an enormous, in the 1950s, and there was an enormous controversy about who owned the pain that she was representing. And so it seems to me that you're absolutely right, that none of this is simple. And I think that the most interesting is a bland way of putting it, the most pressing issue, at least in my context, I can't speak for beyond the US really in this regard, is to try to think through how to respect difference, but not be balkanized within it, and not to discount power disequilibriums. It ends up being very complicated, right? Because visibility in many ways is the power of being part of what is represented, and yet visibility can also be a means of suppression. So that's why, in a way, you know, I'm struck by, it is true, I'm sort of like an optimistic pessimist. Like, my work is often pessimistic, but with an optimistic wish. I don't know, that doesn't make any sense, I guess. But I think that it's better to admit that we don't really have such easy access to one another, and to really kind of think how we can do that in an ethical way. That really interests me, and I do think the museum is a site where that can happen. But I think that, you know, there are all these interests, like commercial interests, that, you know, saturate our worlds in general, that kind of derail this. But I still do think that that it's a site where this kind of negotiation of visibility and opacity can happen. Yeah. I think, was there a question? Did you have a question?
I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the humor that you talked about as a means of reverting liability into an asset. And how could that be applied maybe to the montage of a museum and not just something that an artist can do? Like, how can the museum be a service to maybe use that humor as well, maybe on a curatorship? I don't know, just...
That's a fascinating idea. I mean, what I was referring to is there's an interesting body of literature among African American scholars in literature and art talking about how a certain kind of stereotypical, you know, basically caricatural racism can be approached through humor, as Robert Colescott does. And so it's a way of turning a liability, a kind of racist assault, into taking control of it. But then you could say, well, does it really do that? But I think your point is really interesting, and no, I haven't thought about that, but I think we should. I mean, I'm not sure what a humorous approach in a museum would be, because, you know, they're so semi-sacred museums, so interesting. Thank you for that. We're out of time?
We are out of time. Finished?
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.